I was in the park with my daughter when an old man reached towards her and said, "Such a beautiful baby girl. Can I see her waist?" "Get the F away from me," I responded, putting my daughter back into her baby stroller. He stumbled backward, his face going gray. Other parents called 911 while I stood there clutching Mackenzie's stroller. As the paramedics loaded him up, he grabbed one of their arms and pointed at Mackenzie, gasping something about the little dip on the left side, just like Margaret's. The paramedic looked at me with this strange expression and asked if we knew him. I said no, but my skin crawled. Mackenzie did have this tiny indentation on her left waist, but it was one you'd only notice if you changed her diapers. I switched parks after that. But 2 weeks later at the library playground, he was right there on the bench. I turned to leave, but Mackenzie yanked her hand from mine and ran straight to him. "Grandpa!" Usually she was scared of strangers, but now she was jumping right into his lap. I grabbed her and she started having a complete meltdown, screaming, "I want Grandpa!" so loud that other parents were staring. Then she started humming this melody I'd never heard, some old creepy lullaby. "Grandpa taught me," she said, "when he visits at night." My blood went ice cold. "What do you mean visits at night?" "In my room, through the window." I carried her to the car while she thrashed and screamed for Grandpa Joe. She'd never acted like this. That night I found her standing at her window at 3 a.m., just staring out the window. When I touched her shoulder, she didn't even turn around. "He's coming back," she said in this flat voice that I barely recognized. The grocery store was worse. He was following us through the aisles, getting closer each time. Mackenzie kept trying to run to him and I had to hold her hand so tight she complained it hurt. At checkout, he was right behind us. He leaned in and whispered, "She holds her left ear when she's tired." Emily did that too. You can't fight genetics. I hadn't slept in 3 days when I found the envelope on my windshield. Inside was a birthday card. "Happy 4th birthday, Mackenzie," even though her birthday was 2 months away. But the worst part was the photo tucked inside. It was of Mackenzie at her daycare playground. A photo I didn't take. I tried to call CPS, but they told me he was diagnosed with dementia and was too old to do anything. The next week I was at the playground and had to use the bathroom desperately. The family restroom was right there, 20 feet away. Mackenzie was on the baby swings with other moms around. When I came out, he had her in his arms, walking toward the parking lot. Mackenzie had her head on his shoulder like she belonged there. I screamed and ran after them. Other parents started chasing too. He set her down gently when he saw us coming and pulled out an old Polaroid. The girl in the photo was wearing the exact yellow strawberry dress Mackenzie had on. The exact same one. But the photo was clearly from the 90s. "Where did you get a picture of my daughter?" "That's not your daughter. That's mine. And she's coming home." That night, I nailed Mackenzie's windows shut and pushed her dresser against the door. But at 2 a.m., I heard her voice from inside her room, talking to someone. I shoved the dresser aside and found her room empty, the window somehow open, the nails on the floor. She was in the backyard in her pajamas, reaching up toward him. "Time to go home, Emily," he was saying to her. I called 911 while running outside. I grabbed Mackenzie and she bit me, screaming, "I want to go with Grandpa. You're not my real mommy." The police found him hiding in the shed. Mackenzie fought them when they took him away, screaming until her voice went hoarse. I couldn't take it anymore. While Mackenzie was at daycare the next day, with strict instructions not to release her to anyone but me, I searched everything. Emily Parcell missing child, 1993. The article made me sick. 3-year-old vanished during custody. The father, Richard Parcell, took her and she was never found. The photo of Emily was a girl who looked exactly like Mackenzie. I clicked through every article I could find about Emily Parcell. My laptop screen glowed in the dark living room while Mackenzie slept down the hall. The resemblance between Emily and Mackenzie was there in every photo. Same round face, same light brown hair, same way their noses crinkled. But it had to be coincidence because the other option didn't make sense. Emily vanished in 1993 and Mackenzie was born in 2019. I printed out everything. The missing child report, the custody battle articles, photos of Richard from back then. Younger, but definitely the same man. By the time the sun came up, I had a folder 2 inches thick and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I checked on Mackenzie 3 times during those hours, just to make sure she was still in her bed, still breathing, still mine. At 7 in the morning, I called the police non-emergency number with the folder spread across my kitchen table. The operator listened to everything. The stalking, the break-ins, the nighttime visits Mackenzie talked about. She transferred me to Detective Haley Vaughn, who asked me to come to the station that afternoon. I needed to bring all my documentation and any evidence I had. I agreed and hung up, feeling like someone finally believed me. Mackenzie woke up asking for breakfast like it was any normal day. I made her pancakes and tried to act normal while my brain kept screaming. At 8:30, I drove her to daycare and walked her inside instead of doing drop-off. The director, Lois, was in her office doing paperwork. I asked if we could talk privately, and she brought me in, closing the door. I showed her the photos of Richard, explained about him showing up at parks and stores. I told her about Mackenzie's claims that he visits her room at night. Lois's face went serious. She said we needed a password system immediately. Only someone with the password could pick up Mackenzie, even if they claimed to be family or had ID. We picked a random word that Mackenzie wouldn't know. Strawberry. I wrote it in Lois's book and in my phone. Lois promised to brief all the staff before lunch. She walked me out and I watched through the window as Mackenzie played with blocks, totally unaware that her whole world had shifted. At 2 o'clock, I walked into the police station carrying my folder of printouts and the birthday card Richard left on my windshield. Detective Vaughn met me in the lobby. She was maybe 40, with dark hair pulled back and this calm energy that made me feel less crazy. We went to a small interview room with a table and chairs. She asked me to start from the beginning, so I did. The first encounter at the park when he collapsed, finding him at the library playground, the grocery store, the envelope on my windshield, breaking into my house and taking Mackenzie from the backyard. Detective Vaughn took notes without interrupting. When I finished, she asked to see the evidence. I handed over the birthday card, the Polaroid of the girl in the yellow dress, and all my printouts about Emily Parcel. She examined each item carefully, taking photos with her phone for the case file. She asked specific questions about dates and times, locations, what Richard said each time. I answered everything I could remember. After about an hour, she set down her pen and looked at me directly. She said she believed me and that this was a serious situation. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe properly. She explained she needed to verify some information, but she would call me tomorrow morning with next steps. I left the station feeling lighter even though nothing had actually changed yet. The next morning, Detective Vaughn called at 9. She confirmed that Richard Parcel matched the father from the 1993 missing child case. He'd been living alone in a small house about 15 minutes from my neighborhood for the past 8 years. She'd pulled his records and found the dementia diagnosis from 2 years ago. She explained that his medical condition complicated things legally, because prosecutors would have trouble proving intent. But it didn't eliminate the threat to Mackenzie's safety. His dementia might actually make him more dangerous because he genuinely believed Mackenzie was Emily. Detective Vaughn said she was contacting Adult Protective Services to assess whether Richard could safely live on his own. An investigator named Vernon Wade would be doing a home visit within the next few days. She also recommended I speak with an attorney about getting a restraining order. She gave me a name, Neil Kaufman, who specialized in family protection cases. I thanked her and immediately looked up Neil's office online. His next available appointment was that afternoon at 4. I took it. I spent the rest of the morning installing security cameras. I bought a set online with next-day shipping after the backyard incident. Motion sensor cameras for every window and door. I mounted them on the outside of the house, drilling into the siding, running the wires through to the receiver inside. My hands stayed steady the whole time. Having Detective Vaughn take me seriously made everything feel more manageable. I downloaded the app and tested each camera. They all worked perfectly. By 3 o'clock, I had live feeds of every entrance to my house on my phone. That evening, I checked the doorbell camera feed while making dinner. At 6:15, Richard walked slowly past my house. He stopped right in front of Mackenzie's bedroom window and just stood there staring up at it for almost 2 minutes. Then he continued down the sidewalk and disappeared from view. 20 minutes later, he came back from the other direction and did the same thing. Stood there staring at her window. I saved both video clips and texted them to Detective Vaughn. She responded that she was documenting everything for the restraining order case. That night, I pushed Mackenzie's dresser against her door from the inside. I laid out my sleeping bag on her floor with a baseball bat next to me. Mackenzie asked why we were having a sleepover in her room. I forced my voice to sound cheerful and told her we were practicing camping. She thought that was fun and wanted to tell stories. I made up stories about brave princesses and friendly dragons until she fell asleep. Then I lay there in the dark listening to every sound. The house settling, cars passing outside, my own heartbeat. I didn't sleep at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Richard's face in the backyard reaching for Mackenzie. Detective Vaughn called again the next morning at 8. She'd contacted Adult Protective Services and they were taking the case seriously. The investigator Vernon Wade had Richard's address and would be doing a home visit that day to assess his living conditions and mental state. They would determine whether he could safely live independently or needed supervised care. She said this process could take a few weeks, but it was important for building our case. I asked what I should do in the meantime. She said document everything, keep Mackenzie close, and get that restraining order filed as soon as possible. I met with Neil Kaufman at his office downtown at 4 that afternoon. His waiting room had comfortable chairs and magazines, but I couldn't sit still. When he called me back, his office was filled with law books and framed certificates. He was maybe 50 with gray hair and glasses. I explained everything again while he took notes on a legal pad. The stalking, the break-ins, Mackenzie's disturbing attachment to Richard, the connection to Emily Parcel's disappearance. Neil listened without judgment. When I finished, he explained the process for getting a temporary restraining order. We would need to document every incident with specific dates, times, and locations. We would need evidence like the birthday card, the videos, and witness statements from other parents who'd seen Richard's behavior. The court would review our petition and schedule an emergency hearing. If granted, the temporary order would require Richard to stay a certain distance away from me and Mackenzie. The whole process would cost money I didn't really have, but I couldn't afford not to do it. Neil said he could work with me on payment. We spent the next 2 hours going through everything systematically, building the strongest case possible. Neil helped me fill out the paperwork that same afternoon. We documented every single incident in careful detail. The park collapse on May 3rd, the library playground on May 17th, the grocery store on May 22nd, the birthday card on May 25th, the attempted abduction at the playground on May 29th, the backyard break-in on June 1st. Each entry included the date, time, location, what Richard did, what he said, and who witnessed it. We attached copies of the birthday card, the Polaroid, the police reports, and the security camera footage. Neil filed the emergency petition with the courthouse before they closed at 5. The clerk stamped it and scheduled our hearing for 3 days from now on, Friday morning at 9. 3 days felt like forever when I pulled up the camera feeds on my phone and saw Richard had circled my block 4 times that evening. Each time he stopped at Mackenzie's window. Each time he stood there for minutes just staring up at her room. I saved every single video clip and sent them to Detective Vaughn and Neil. This was our evidence. This was proof that he wouldn't stop. Friday couldn't come fast enough. The pediatrician got us an appointment with Camille Meyer for the next afternoon. Her office was in a small building near the hospital with toys in the waiting room and colorful posters on the walls. Camille had short brown hair and wore jeans with a cardigan, nothing like the serious doctors I'd pictured. She knelt down to Mackenzie's level and asked if she wanted to play with the dollhouse in her office. Mackenzie nodded and took her hand without any of the stranger anxiety she used to have. I followed them into a room filled with toys, art supplies, and a kid-sized table with chairs. Camille sat on the floor next to Mackenzie and pulled out the dollhouse, asking her to show which room was her favorite. Mackenzie picked the bedroom and started arranging the tiny furniture. Camille handed her different dolls and asked her to pick which one was her. Mackenzie chose a little girl doll with dark hair. Then Camille asked if anyone else lived in the house. Mackenzie added a mommy doll and put her in the kitchen. She played quietly for a few minutes, moving the dolls around the rooms. Camille asked if the little girl ever had visitors. Mackenzie picked up a grandpa doll from the box and put him at the window of the bedroom. My stomach twisted, but I stayed quiet like Camille had told me to before we started. Camille asked what the grandpa was doing there. Mackenzie made the grandpa doll tap on the window. She said he was saying hello to the little girl because he missed her. Camille nodded and asked if the little girl was happy to see him. Mackenzie made the little girl doll jump up and down. Then she said something that made my blood go cold. She said the grandpa told her she used to live in a different house with different toys before she came to live with the mommy. Camille's expression didn't change at all. She just asked Mackenzie what made her feel safe in her house now. Mackenzie thought about it and set her nightlight and when mommy sleeps in her room. Camille praised her for knowing what helps her feel safe. They played for another 20 minutes with Camille gently redirecting whenever Mackenzie brought up the grandpa. After the session, Camille had Mackenzie color in the waiting room while we talked in her office. She explained that Mackenzie's attachment to Richard came from his absolute certainty about who she was. Kids that age need adults to be sure about things, and Richard was completely convinced Mackenzie was his daughter. The attention he gave her, the special treatment, the secret visits, all of it made her feel chosen and important. It wasn't about any real past connection. Camille recommended twice-weekly sessions and gave me printed scripts for how to reinforce boundaries without scaring Mackenzie. She said to validate Mackenzie's feelings while being firm about the facts. Say things like, I know you feel confused, but I'm your mom and I've always been your mom. Camille also gave me a list of signs to watch for that might mean Mackenzie needed more intensive help. I left with the scripts folded in my purse and another appointment scheduled for 3 days later. That evening I had to get groceries because we were out of everything. I thought about leaving Mackenzie with a friend, but I was too paranoid about who I could trust. The store was busy with people getting dinner supplies. We got a cart and I put Mackenzie in the seat facing me so I could watch her. We made it through produce and the bread aisle without problems. Then we turned into the cereal aisle and Richard was standing at the far end looking at boxes. Mackenzie saw him before I could turn the cart around. She started squirming and reaching toward him. I grabbed her hand, but she was pulling hard, trying to get out of the cart seat. Richard walked toward us, pushing his own cart. Other shoppers were in the aisle watching this happen. I picked Mackenzie up out of the cart and she started screaming his name. Full volume screaming that echoed off the walls and ceiling. People stopped shopping to stare at us. Mackenzie was thrashing in my arms trying to get down. She kept yelling that she wanted Grandpa and why wouldn't I let her go to him. I carried her toward the checkout with our half-full cart abandoned in the aisle. She was crying so hard she could barely breathe. I could hear Richard's cart behind us following at a distance. The checkout lines were long and Mackenzie wouldn't stop screaming. A woman asked if she needed help. I said no and tried to sound normal, but my voice was shaking. We got through checkout with Mackenzie still crying and fighting me. I loaded her into her car seat while she kicked and hit at my hands. Richard was standing by his car 3 spaces away watching us. I got in and locked the doors and drove home with Mackenzie sobbing in the back seat. When we got home, I called the store and asked to speak to the manager. I explained what happened and asked if they had security cameras. The manager said yes and asked me to come back the next day to review the footage. I went back the next morning without Mackenzie. The manager brought me to a small office with monitors showing different store angles. He pulled up yesterday's footage and we watched Richard enter the store 10 minutes before me. The timestamp showed he went straight to the cereal aisle and waited there. The manager fast-forwarded through the past 2 weeks of footage. Richard appeared in 12 different recordings, always arriving within 15 minutes of when I showed up. The manager printed out the timestamps and said he would ban Richard from the store effective immediately. He also said he'd send the footage to Detective Vaughn, whose card I'd given him. I thanked him and left feeling sick about how long Richard had been tracking my schedule. Vernon Wade called that afternoon while Mackenzie was napping. He'd completed his home visit to Richard's house that morning. The place was a mess with spoiled food in the fridge and unpaid bills stacked on the counter. The walls were covered with photos of Emily from the 90s. School pictures, birthday parties, everyday snapshots, all of the same little girl who looked so much like Mackenzie. Vernon said Richard's cognitive testing showed moderate dementia with severe fixation on his missing daughter. His short-term memory was failing, but his memories of Emily were stuck in a loop. Vernon explained that Richard genuinely believed he was rescuing his own child. His brain couldn't process that Emily was gone and Mackenzie was a different person. The dementia made him certain that Mackenzie was Emily, and everyone else was lying to him. Vernon was clear that this didn't make Richard less dangerous. It actually made him more unpredictable because he couldn't understand or remember warnings. The APS case would take time to process, but Vernon was flagging it as urgent given the stalking behavior. Friday morning came and I put on the only professional clothes I owned. Neil met me at the courthouse at 8:30. The hearing was scheduled for 9 in a small courtroom with wooden benches. Richard arrived with a public defender who looked tired and overworked. The judge was a woman in her 50s who reviewed our petition before calling the hearing to order. Neil presented our documentation first. The birthday card, the Polaroid, the police reports, the security footage from my house and the grocery store. He called me to testify and I explained every incident from the park collapse to the backyard break-in to the grocery store yesterday. My voice stayed steady even though my hands were shaking. Richard's defender argued that his client was a confused elderly man with dementia who needed medical treatment, not legal punishment. He said Richard wasn't capable of understanding the harm he was causing. He showed the court Richard's medical records and the APS report. The judge listened to both sides without showing what she was thinking. She asked Richard directly if he understood why we were in court. Richard looked confused and said something about needing to bring Emily home. The judge made her ruling after a 10-minute recess. She granted a temporary restraining order requiring Richard to stay at least 500 feet from me, Mackenzie, our home, and the daycare. The order would last until the full hearing in 30 days. Richard's defender helped him stand up and explained the order to him 3 times, but Richard kept asking where Emily was. Detective Vaughn met me outside the courtroom and explained that enforcement would be hard. Richard might not remember the order existed or understand what 500 feet meant. She said to call 911 immediately if I saw him anywhere near us. 2 days later, I went to pick up Mackenzie from daycare at the usual time. Lois met me at the door instead of bringing Mackenzie out like normal. She said Richard was across the street calling Mackenzie's name over the fence. All the kids were inside in the back room away from the windows. Lois had already called 911 and they were on their way. I waited in the office with my heart pounding while Lois kept watch at the front door. Through the window, I could see Richard standing on the sidewalk across the street. He was too far away for me to hear what he was saying, but I could see his mouth moving. Police arrived 6 minutes later and I watched them talk to Richard through the window. They measured the distance with one of those rolling wheel things and came back shaking their heads. Richard was standing exactly 510 feet from the daycare entrance. The officer explained that the restraining order required 500 feet, and Richard was technically in compliance even though he was clearly positioning himself as close as legally possible. I felt sick watching them document everything with photos and measurements but then just let him walk away. Detective Vaughn called me 20 minutes later while I was still sitting in the daycare office. She said she was filing a supplemental report noting Richard's deliberate positioning at the legal boundary and his continued attempts to contact Mackenzie despite the court order. Her voice sounded frustrated too, but she explained that without an actual violation, they couldn't arrest him. I picked up Mackenzie from the back room where she'd been playing with blocks and carried her to the car. She seemed fine during the drive home and ate her dinner normally, but at 2 in the morning I woke up to screaming. I ran to her room and found her thrashing in bed with her eyes squeezed shut. She was yelling something about a man taking her away, and me not being able to find her. I scooped her up and rocked her on the floor of her room using the calming scripts Camille had taught me. Deep breaths, safe place visualization, naming 5 things she could see in the room. Mackenzie's body stayed rigid against mine, and she kept looking at her window like someone might climb through it. After an hour of trying, I gave up on getting her back to sleep in her own bed. I carried her to my bedroom and she clung to my neck the whole way. She wouldn't let go even when I tried to set her down on my bed. I grabbed the sleeping bag from the hall closet and spread it out on the floor next to my bed. Mackenzie crawled into it immediately and pulled the edges tight around her body. I sat on the floor next to her until her breathing evened out, but I couldn't sleep myself. Every small sound made me check the window locks and door handle. In the morning, I called Camille and explained what happened. She said the sleeping bag arrangement was fine temporarily while we worked on rebuilding Mackenzie's sense of security. The nightmares were normal given everything she'd experienced and witnessed. Camille scheduled an extra session for later that week. Detective Vaughn called again that afternoon with better news. She'd obtained security footage from the library where Richard first approached us weeks ago. The footage showed Richard sitting on a bench near the playground on 3 separate occasions before the day Mackenzie ran to him. He'd been watching her play for at least 20 minutes each time. The pattern of stalking was even clearer now with this documentation. Detective Vaughn said she was adding it to our case file and sending copies to Neil for the full restraining order hearing. Vernon Wade called the next day while Mackenzie was at daycare. He was filing for emergency guardianship of Richard through APS. The petition argued Richard was a danger to himself and others due to his dementia and obsessive behavior. Vernon warned me the process would take weeks, because the court system moved slowly even for emergency cases. He needed to schedule a competency evaluation and get medical records and arrange a hearing date. I thanked him and tried not to think about how many more weeks of Richard circling us like a shark. Neil was busy too. He called to say he was gathering statements from everyone who'd witnessed Richard's behavior. The daycare staff who saw him at pickup time, the grocery store manager who reviewed the security footage, the neighbors who'd seen Richard watching our house at night. We were building a case that showed Richard's behavior was persistent and escalating despite warnings and legal orders. Neil sounded confident we'd get the full-year restraining order at the hearing. I went to therapy with Mackenzie on Thursday afternoon and parked in the lot behind the building. The session went well. Camille worked with Mackenzie on a worksheet about real memories versus stories someone told you. Mackenzie seemed to understand the difference when Camille used examples about her favorite cartoon characters. But when I came out to the parking lot after the session, I found another envelope tucked under my windshield wiper. My hands shook as I pulled it out. Inside was a note on lined paper torn from a spiral notebook. The handwriting was shaky and went up and down across the lines like a child had written it. It said, "Emily, Daddy loves you. Come home." The childlike quality made it worse somehow, more disturbing than if it had been threatening. I took photos of the note and called Detective Vaughn from the car. She said to bring it to the station, and she'd add it to the evidence file. During our next therapy session, Camille used picture cards to help Mackenzie distinguish between things that really happened and things Grandpa Joe told her about. Mackenzie picked through the cards slowly. She put the playground in the real pile and the nighttime window visits in the real pile too, which made my chest hurt. But when Camille asked about Emily and the stories about living somewhere before, Mackenzie hesitated, and then put those cards in the stories pile. She was starting to understand that Grandpa Joe's stories about before weren't her actual memories. Small progress, but it felt huge. Lois called me at work the following Monday. The daycare had installed a buzzer entry system over the weekend. All the doors were locked now, and parents had to be buzzed in after showing ID through the camera. They'd updated their emergency protocols too, with photos of Richard, and instructions to call police immediately if he appeared anywhere near the property. I felt guilty that our situation had forced them to spend money and change their whole system. Lois told me not to worry about it. They'd needed better security anyway, and this pushed them to prioritize it. Detective Vaughn stopped by my house that evening after Mackenzie was asleep. She'd spent the afternoon interviewing neighbors on Richard Street. Several of them said Richard had been talking about getting Emily back for months. He'd shown them old Polaroids and told them his daughter was taken from him illegally. The neighbors thought he was just a lonely old man talking about the past. None of them realized he was actively stalking a child who looked like his missing daughter. One neighbor said Richard had asked to borrow his car last week to drive across town. The neighbor had said no because Richard's license was expired. Detective Vaughn documented all of it for our case file. Neil called me 2 days later to say Richard's public defender had reached out about a possible deal. Richard would agree to go into assisted living voluntarily if we dropped the restraining order request. Neil told me right away he thought it was a bad idea because there was nothing stopping Richard from just walking out of the facility whenever he wanted. I agreed immediately. We couldn't trust that Richard would stay anywhere without legal requirements forcing him to. The hearing was still scheduled and we were moving forward with the full order. That Thursday, I took Mackenzie to see Camille again and watched through the observation window as my daughter sat at the small table with crayons and paper. Camille asked her to draw our house and Mackenzie worked slowly, adding windows first and then coloring each one with thick black lines. She drew hearts all around the house in red crayon, filling the whole page with them. When Camille asked what the black lines were, Mackenzie said they were the locks that kept bad people out. Camille showed me the drawing afterward and explained that Mackenzie was starting to understand the idea of safety and protection. It was small progress, but it made my chest feel a little less tight. On Saturday morning, I drove to a community center across town for a support group that Detective Vaughn had recommended. 8 other parents sat in a circle talking about restraining orders and custody battles and people who wouldn't leave them alone. One mom described finding her ex-husband in her backyard at midnight. Another dad talked about his former partner showing up at their kids' school 3 times in 1 week. Hearing their stories made me feel less alone in this whole nightmare. Everyone nodded when I talked about feeling like I was barely holding it together despite doing everything right. They understood in a way that my regular friends couldn't. Vernon called on Monday while I was at work to give me an update on the guardianship petition. The emergency hearing was scheduled, but the earliest court date available was 3 weeks away. He sounded frustrated about the delay, but explained that the system moved slowly even for urgent cases. In the meantime, he was arranging for daily welfare checks on Richard to monitor his behavior and mental state. The checks would create a record of his functioning that would help support the guardianship case. I thanked him and tried not to think about 3 more weeks of Richard being free to circle our neighborhood. That night, Mackenzie was playing with her dolls on the living room floor when she looked up at me and asked if she was really Emily. My heart stopped for a second, but I sat down next to her and used the simple words Camille had coached me on. I told her there was a little girl named Emily a long time ago who looked like her, but Mackenzie was Mackenzie and had always been my daughter. She thought about this for a minute and then asked if that meant Grandpa Joe was confused. I said yes, his brain was sick and made him mixed up about who people were. She seemed satisfied with that answer and went back to playing with her dolls. The full restraining order hearing happened on a Wednesday morning 2 weeks later. I sat at a table with Neil while Richard sat across the courtroom with his public defender. The judge called the hearing to order and Neil presented all our evidence first. He showed the birthday card and the note and the photos. He played the grocery store security footage. He read statements from the daycare staff and the neighbors and the parents who witnessed incidents at the park and library. The public defender argued that Richard needed mental health treatment instead of legal punishment. He talked about Richard's dementia diagnosis and his age and his confusion. He said Richard wasn't a criminal, just a sick old man who needed help. Neil stood up and calmly demonstrated how Richard's behavior had escalated over months despite warnings. He showed the pattern of stalking and the evidence of planning like the photos taken at the daycare. He explained that dementia didn't make Richard less dangerous to Mackenzie's safety. The judge listened to everything and then took a short break to review the evidence. When she came back, she granted a 1-year restraining order with the same 500-foot distance requirements. She said that dementia didn't take away the need to protect Mackenzie from being followed and potentially taken. Richard looked confused during the whole ruling and kept leaning over to ask his lawyer who Mackenzie was. After the hearing ended, Detective Vaughn pulled me aside in the hallway outside the courtroom. She explained that the restraining order was only as good as Richard's ability to remember it existed. That's why the APS guardianship process was so important for actually keeping Mackenzie safe long term. She promised to keep doing regular patrols near our house and the daycare. I felt relieved but also exhausted knowing we still weren't really done with this. The next week passed quietly with no Richard sightings anywhere. I checked the doorbell camera constantly, but he never walked past our house. Mackenzie didn't mention Grandpa Joe or ask about Emily. I started to hope that maybe the court appearance had scared him, or his dementia had shifted his focus to something else. On Friday night, Mackenzie asked if she could sleep in her own room instead of on my floor. I helped her get ready for bed and tucked her in, and she fell asleep easily without any nightmares. It felt like maybe we were finally getting back to normal. But on Sunday afternoon, my phone rang with a call from Detective Vaughn. A woman at the park had just called 911 because Richard approached her and started talking about his granddaughter being kept from him illegally. The woman recognized the situation from posts on the neighborhood social media group and called the police right away instead of engaging with him. I drove straight to the park when Detective Vaughn called. 2 police cars were already there with their lights going. Richard was sitting on a bench looking confused while an officer stood next to him asking questions. The woman who called 911 was standing off to the side with her kids. I parked and walked over but stayed back where Richard couldn't see me clearly. The officer was asking him for his address, and Richard kept giving different answers. None of them right. He said he lived on Oak Street, then Maple Avenue. Then he just stopped talking and stared at his hands. The officer asked him how he got to the park, and Richard said he walked but couldn't remember from where. He kept asking about his granddaughter and saying she needed him. The paramedics showed up and checked his blood pressure and temperature. One of them shined a light in his eyes and asked him what year it was. Richard said 1995. The paramedic looked at his partner and they both nodded like they'd seen this before. They convinced Richard to go with them to the hospital for evaluation, and he went without fighting. Detective Vaughn came over to me after the ambulance left and explained that Richard was placed on a psychiatric hold for 72 hours. The hospital would evaluate him and decide if he needed to stay longer. She said this was actually good for our case because it showed how much his mental state had gotten worse. I felt relieved but also strange watching them take him away looking so lost. Vernon Wade called me the next afternoon while I was picking Mackenzie up from daycare. The hospital social worker had contacted him about Richard's evaluation results. Richard couldn't remember where he lived or how to get home. He didn't know what month it was, or recognize the names of his neighbors when they asked him. The social worker was worried about him being alone and thought he might hurt himself by accident. Vernon said he was going to fast-track the guardianship petition using this hospital visit as proof that Richard needed help right away. He explained that the court would probably approve emergency placement now instead of making us wait weeks. I thanked him and felt this weird mix of relief and guilt. Richard was dangerous to Mackenzie, but he was also just a sick old man who couldn't take care of himself anymore. Neil called 2 days later and said the psychiatric team wanted a victim impact statement from me. He offered to come with me to the hospital and I said yes because I didn't want to go alone. We met in the parking lot and walked in together. The psychiatric unit was on the 4th floor with locked doors and a buzzer system. A nurse let us in and took us to a small conference room. The psychiatrist was a woman in her 50s who introduced herself and asked me to describe what Richard had been doing. I told her everything while Neil took notes. The stalking at different locations. The photos he took without permission. The break-in at our house. Mackenzie's nightmares and her attachment to him. The psychiatrist listened carefully and asked specific questions about how often Richard showed up and what he said to Mackenzie. After about 30 minutes, she thanked me and said this information was very helpful. Neil and I left and walked back to the parking lot. I asked him what happens next, and he said they would decide if Richard needed to stay in the hospital or go somewhere else. On the drive home, I kept thinking about Richard in that hospital gown looking small and confused. I hated him for scaring Mackenzie, but I also felt sad that his brain was so broken he couldn't understand what he'd done wrong. The psychiatrist called Vernon Wade the next day with her recommendation. Richard didn't recognize me during the evaluation when they brought me back in to see if he remembered who I was. He just stared at me like I was a stranger. But when the psychiatrist said Mackenzie's name, he got upset and started talking fast about saving Emily from people who took her. He kept saying he needed to bring her home before it was too late. The psychiatrist tried to calm him down, but he got more worked up until a nurse had to give him medication. The psychiatrist told Vernon that Richard needed to be in a secured memory care facility as soon as possible. His dementia was getting worse fast, and he was a danger to himself and others. Vernon called me that evening to explain what would happen next. He was filing for emergency placement in a facility that specialized in dementia patients. The facility had special locks on all the doors and GPS trackers on the residents in case they tried to leave. Vernon said it would probably take a few days to get approval, but the hospital agreed to keep Richard until a bed opened up. Vernon called 4 days later with good news. A memory care facility 30 minutes away had accepted Richard for emergency placement. The facility had a whole unit just for dementia patients who wandered or had behavior problems. Every exit had wander guards that would set off alarms if residents tried to leave. The staff was trained to handle people who got confused or aggressive. Vernon said Richard would be transferred directly from the hospital to the facility without going home first. He promised they would call the police right away if Richard tried to leave or started talking about Mackenzie again. I felt this huge weight lift off my shoulders knowing Richard would be somewhere safe where he couldn't follow us anymore. I took Mackenzie to see Camille the next week for her regular therapy session. Camille had this new approach she wanted to try. She sat down with Mackenzie and used simple words to explain that sometimes people's brains get sick, just like bodies get sick. When brains get sick, they can make people confused about who other people are. Mackenzie listened carefully, and then asked if that's what happened to Grandpa Joe. Camille said yes. His brain got sick and made him think Mackenzie was someone else named Emily. Mackenzie thought about this for a minute and asked if that's why he kept following us. I said yes. His sick brain made him confused and he didn't understand he was scaring us. Mackenzie seemed to accept this explanation better than anything else we'd tried. She went back to playing with the dollhouse and didn't mention Grandpa Joe again for the rest of the session. Richard was transferred to the memory care facility on a Thursday morning. Vernon Wade called to confirm he'd arrived safely and was getting settled in his new room. The staff had done an intake evaluation and put together a care plan for him. Vernon said the facility would notify the police immediately if Richard tried to leave or became focused on finding Mackenzie again. He also said the facility had strict visitor rules, and I would be notified if anyone tried to visit Richard who wasn't approved. I thanked him for everything he'd done to help keep Mackenzie safe. Vernon said he'd check in with the facility weekly to make sure Richard was adjusting okay and would let me know if anything changed. Detective Vaughn called me a few days later to update me on the case. She was closing the active investigation since Richard was now in a secured facility and couldn't stalk us anymore. But she was keeping the case file open in case Richard somehow violated the restraining order or escaped from the facility. She gave me her direct cell phone number and told me to call immediately if I saw Richard anywhere or if anything suspicious happened. She said she'd also given the facility her contact information so they could reach her if needed. I saved her number in my phone and felt grateful that she'd taken everything so seriously from the beginning. The following Saturday, I decided to test if Mackenzie was ready to go back to normal activities. I took her to the original park where Richard first approached us months ago. My heart was beating fast as we walked up to the playground, but I tried to act normal. Mackenzie ran straight to the swings like nothing had ever happened there. She played for almost an hour, going down the slide and climbing on the monkey bars. She didn't mention Grandpa Joe or ask about him at all. I sat on a bench and watched her play, forcing myself not to constantly scan the area for threats. Other parents were there with their kids and everything felt normal and safe. We stayed until Mackenzie got tired and asked to go home. On the drive back, she talked about wanting to come back next weekend to play on the swings again. Neil called me on Monday morning about extending the restraining order. He explained that the current order was only good for 1 year, but we could file for an extension that would last much longer. Given Richard's age and how fast his dementia was getting worse, Neil recommended filing for an extension that would cover the rest of Richard's likely remaining life. He said we could do it as a paperwork filing without needing another court hearing since Richard was now in a secured facility. I agreed and Neil said he'd prepare the paperwork and file it that week. 3 days later, he called to say the court had approved the extension without any problems. The restraining order was now in effect for the next 20 years, or until Richard died, whichever came first. 2 weeks later, I sat in Camille's office for Mackenzie's regular session while she played with the dollhouse in the corner. Camille pulled out her notes and told me Mackenzie's nightmares had dropped from every night to maybe once a week. She wasn't asking about Grandpa Joe anymore, or mentioning Emily at all during their play sessions. Camille explained that the therapy focus was shifting now from processing the trauma to building general coping skills for anxiety. Mackenzie needed tools for managing scary feelings in healthy ways, instead of staying stuck on what happened with Richard. I watched Mackenzie arrange the dollhouse furniture and felt something loosen in my chest. She looked like a normal kid playing, not a child haunted by an old man's delusions. Camille scheduled our next appointment and reminded me to keep using the calming scripts at bedtime. Vernon Wade called me that Thursday afternoon while I was folding laundry. He had visited Richard at the memory care facility and wanted to give me an update. Richard was adjusting well to the structured routine, and his fixation on Emily had decreased significantly with the new medication regimen. Vernon said Richard still mentioned his daughter sometimes during activities, but he didn't get agitated or try to leave the building anymore. The staff reported he seemed content with the daily schedule and enjoyed the group activities they organized. Vernon assured me the facility would contact police immediately if anything changed, or if Richard showed any signs of becoming obsessed with finding Mackenzie again. I thanked him and hung up feeling grateful that Richard was somewhere safe where he couldn't hurt us or himself. That weekend I started taking down some of the security cameras I'd installed during the worst of it. I left the doorbell camera up and kept the window locks but removed the motion sensors from Mackenzie's room and the backyard cameras. Mackenzie noticed me unscrewing the camera mount in the hallway and asked if we were safe now. I told her yes while knowing deep down I'd probably always be a little more watchful than other parents. Some part of me would always be scanning playgrounds and checking over my shoulder, even though the actual threat was locked away in a memory care unit 15 minutes from here. On Monday morning, Lois pulled me aside during daycare drop-off with a huge smile on her face. She told me Mackenzie had been playing normally with the other kids for 2 weeks straight without any separation anxiety or clinginess. No tears at drop-off, no asking for me during the day, just regular 4-year-old behavior. Lois said this felt like a major milestone in our recovery, and she was really proud of how far Mackenzie had come. I felt tears prick my eyes because I hadn't realized how much Mackenzie's anxiety had been affecting her daily life, until it finally lifted. Detective Vaughn called me the following week to follow up on the case. She explained that the cold case unit had looked into Emily Parcel's disappearance again after everything that happened with Richard. They reviewed all the old evidence and interviewed people who knew the family back in 1993, but found no new leads. Detective Vaughn confirmed there was absolutely no connection between Emily and Mackenzie beyond a superficial resemblance that Richard's broken brain had latched onto. She told me Emily's case would stay open, but the chances of solving a 30-year-old missing child case were basically zero at this point. I thanked her for taking everything so seriously from the beginning and for helping keep Mackenzie safe. That Friday, I packed bags for Mackenzie and drove 3 hours to my parents' house for the weekend. This was the first time I'd felt safe enough to leave our immediate area since Richard started following us. Being around family who knew the whole story and just let us be normal helped more than I expected. My mom played with Mackenzie in the backyard while my dad grilled burgers, and nobody asked me a million questions about how I was handling everything. We just existed together like a regular family having a regular weekend. Mackenzie slept in my childhood bedroom and didn't have any nightmares or wake up scared. At our next therapy session, Camille suggested we could reduce our appointments to once weekly instead of twice. She explained that Mackenzie was showing consistent progress, and the immediate threat had been contained with Richard in the secured facility. Camille recommended we continue therapy for a few more months to make sure the improvements stuck, and to give Mackenzie more tools for managing anxiety long-term. I agreed because I wanted to make sure we didn't stop too soon and have everything fall apart again. The following Tuesday, I was pushing my cart through the grocery store when I recognized one of the moms from the library playground incident. She approached me looking uncomfortable and apologized for not understanding the situation at the time. She told me several parents from that day had talked about being more aware of concerning adult behavior around kids now. The whole thing with Richard had made them realize how easy it is to miss warning signs or assume someone is just a harmless grandparent. I appreciated her saying something even though it was awkward for both of us. On Thursday, Mackenzie's preschool teacher stopped me after pickup to comment on how much more relaxed and engaged Mackenzie seemed in class compared to a month ago. She said Mackenzie was participating more in group activities and seemed less anxious during transitions. I realized I'd been so focused on the crisis and the legal stuff and keeping us safe that I hadn't noticed how much Richard's stalking had been affecting Mackenzie's daily functioning at the school. Hearing that she was doing better made me feel like maybe we were actually getting through this. Vernon Wade sent me a final email update the next week. Richard's guardianship was now permanent, and the facility had reported no incidents or escape attempts since he arrived. Richard had settled into the daily routines and seemed content with the structured activities and regular visits from volunteers through a community program. Vernon said he'd close his active case file, but the facility had all my contact information if anything changed. I saved the email and felt a weird mix of relief that it was really over, and sadness for Richard losing his daughter and his mind. I signed up for the Thursday evening support group meeting at the community center, the same one I'd attended twice before when everything felt impossible. Walking into that room with the circle of folding chairs and the smell of stale coffee brought back memories of sitting there shaking and crying, while other parents nodded and understood. This time felt different, though. I wasn't coming for help anymore. I was coming to show people that getting through this kind of nightmare was actually possible. The facilitator recognized me right away and asked if I wanted to share an update. I told the whole story from start to finish, not leaving out the scary parts or the times I thought I was losing my mind. I explained how Vernon got Richard into the secured facility, how Neil helped with all the legal protections, how Camille worked with Mackenzie twice a week until she stopped having nightmares. 3 different parents came up to me after the meeting ended. One mom was dealing with her ex's mother who kept showing up at their house claiming grandparents' rights, even though there was a restraining order. Another dad's neighbor had been following his kids to the school every morning. They all thanked me for being honest about how long everything took, and how many different systems had to work together before Mackenzie was actually safe. I gave them Neil's contact information, and told them to ask for Detective Vaughn specifically if they needed police help. Driving home that night, I felt like maybe all the horrible stuff we went through could at least help someone else get through their own situation a little bit easier. Neil called me on Monday morning and asked me to come by his office to sign some final paperwork. I dropped Mackenzie at preschool and drove to his building, expecting another bill I couldn't really afford. Instead, he had a folder with copies of everything related to our case, all organized with tabs and labels. The restraining order, the APS reports, Richard's guardianship documents, the facility contact information. He walked me through each section and explained what would happen if Richard ever tried to violate the order or if the facility ever needed to reach me. Then he pushed the folder across his desk and told me there was no charge for this final meeting. I started to argue, but he held up his hand. He said he was just glad to see a case where the system actually worked the way it was supposed to work, and a child stayed safe. I thanked him about 5 times before leaving his office with that folder under my arm, feeling like I finally had proof that everything was really over and Mackenzie was really protected. That same week, Mackenzie and I went shopping for new curtains for her bedroom. She picked out ones with stars and moons on them, nothing like the heavy blackout curtains I'd hung up during the worst of it. We took down all the extra locks I'd installed on her windows, and I let her help me pack away the motion sensors and cameras. She asked why we were taking everything down, and I told her we didn't need all that stuff anymore because she was safe now. We established a new bedtime routine that didn't involve checking the windows 3 times or pushing furniture against the door. Instead, we read books about kids going on adventures and being brave. Her favorite was about a girl who explored a magic forest and made friends with talking animals. Mackenzie started asking for that one every single night. I bought a small nightlight shaped like a moon that cast soft shadows on her new curtains. She fell asleep faster and easier than she had in months. Watching her drift off without fear or anxiety made me realize how much the security measures had been affecting her, even though I thought I was just keeping her safe. Detective Vaughn called on Wednesday afternoon while I was folding laundry. She told me she was transferring to a different unit that focused on organized crime investigations. Her replacement had already been briefed on our case and had all the files and contact information. She wanted to call personally before the official handoff happened. I thanked her for taking everything so seriously from the very beginning, and for never making me feel crazy or paranoid. She said I did everything exactly right, and that Mackenzie was lucky to have such a fierce protector. Then she added that most parents in my situation didn't push as hard or document as thoroughly, and that probably made the difference in getting Richard placed so quickly. After we hung up, I sat there holding my phone and feeling grateful that the first officer who responded actually listened and believed me. Saturday morning arrived sunny and warm. I packed snacks and juice boxes and drove Mackenzie to the park where this whole thing started. My hands only shook a little bit as I unbuckled her from her car seat. We walked to the playground and she ran straight for the swings like nothing bad had ever happened there. I sat on the same bench where I'd first seen Richard watching her. This time I didn't scan every face or track every person walking past. I just watched Mackenzie pump her legs and laugh when she went high enough to see over the fence. An older woman sat down on the other end of the bench with her knitting bag. She smiled at me and commented on what a happy child Mackenzie was. I smiled back and agreed, feeling almost normal for the first time in months. We stayed at the park for over an hour and I never once felt my heart race or my hands go cold. Camille scheduled our final regular session for the following Tuesday. She brought a folder of resources and worksheets for me to keep in case Mackenzie ever needed to talk about this period when she got older. We reviewed all the progress Mackenzie had made over the past 2 months. The nightmares had stopped completely. The separation anxiety at preschool drop-off was gone. She no longer mentioned Grandpa Joe or asked about Emily. Camille explained that the early intervention and consistent therapeutic support meant Mackenzie would probably have no lasting trauma from what happened. Kids her age were resilient when they had stable, protective caregivers who helped them process scary experiences in age-appropriate ways. She recommended I keep the resource folder somewhere accessible and consider bringing Mackenzie back for a few sessions if she ever started showing anxiety or asking questions about that time. I left her office feeling confident that we'd actually made it through without Mackenzie carrying permanent damage. Some nights after Mackenzie fell asleep, I found myself thinking about Richard. Not the scary stalking parts, but the fact that he was someone's father who lost his daughter and never recovered. His brain broke from that grief and turned Mackenzie into Emily because he couldn't accept that Emily was gone forever. I felt relieved knowing he was safe in the facility with people taking care of him and making sure he took his medications. But I also felt sad for the daughter he lost 30 years ago, and for the man he used to be before dementia destroyed his ability to tell reality from desperate hope. Mackenzie would never have to carry the burden of his grief or his broken mind. She could just be a regular 4-year-old kid who didn't remember much about the scary old man who thought she was someone else. Thursday evening, Mackenzie asked me if we could get a dog. Not just any dog, but specifically a family dog that would sleep in her room and play with her in the backyard. I realized she was thinking about our future in normal, happy terms instead of scary ones. She wasn't worried about strangers or locked windows anymore. She was thinking about what kind of dog food to buy and whether the dog would like her stuffed animals. We drove to the animal shelter that Saturday and walked through the rows of kennels. Mackenzie fell in love with an older golden retriever mix named Honey, who had the gentlest eyes and the softest ears. The shelter worker explained that Honey was 7 years old and had been surrendered when her previous owner moved into assisted living. She was calm and good with children and already house-trained. We filled out the adoption application right there. The shelter needed to do a home visit first, but the worker said she didn't see any reason why we wouldn't be approved. 3 months had passed since that first day at the park when Richard grabbed Mackenzie's stroller and everything started. I tucked her into her own bed in her own room with the star curtains and the moon nightlight. She snuggled under her blankets with her favorite stuffed rabbit and asked me to sing the goodnight song we'd been doing all week. I sang softly while she closed her eyes. Instead of that creepy lullaby Richard taught her, she hummed along to a song from her favorite cartoon about friendship and adventure. Her breathing slowed and deepened as she drifted into sleep. I stood in her doorway watching her chest rise and fall peacefully. No nightmares waited for her tonight. No scary old man haunted her dreams. Just a regular little girl sleeping safely in her own room while her mom watched over her. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I actually believed we were going to be okay. Remember the takeaways here. Document everything, work with APS for elderly stalkers with dementia, and don't stop pushing until you get real protection. Her thorough approach made all the difference. Hit subscribe if these real cases help you understand how to protect yourself and your family.